Welcome to Minimizing Bias in Teacher Observations. This brief module will define bias, discuss potential sources of bias, and share some potential strategies for reducing bias. You will also have an opportunity to reflect on your potential triggers. This module is initially intended for evaluators, but it may also be helpful for instructional coaches, school administrators, and anyone else providing coaching, conducting classroom walkthroughs, or conducting observations. A grounding tenet of the Rhode Island model is that the implementation of a fair, accurate, and meaningful system will improve teaching and learning. As an evaluator, it is critical that you acknowledge and try to minimize bias. Bias in this context refers to factors unrelated to teaching practice that can influence an observer's collection and rating of evidence. It's important to pay attention to bias and observation not only within the context of educator evaluation, but also during walkthroughs, coaching, and other informal opportunities. In the next slide, we will share some different sources of bias. Central tendency bias is present when an evaluator rates practice using points on the middle of the scale and avoids extremely high or low ratings. There may be many reasons why an evaluator intentionally or unintentionally does this. For example, some evaluators may want to avoid potential conflict among teachers. Others might hold personal beliefs about whether a 4 is attainable or whether a 1 is too low. However, it's important to make sure the level descriptor for a rating reflects what you observed. Otherwise, educators may distrust the system or feel disheartened. When I was in college, I had a professor who said perfection is reserved only for God. So even if you answered every question on a test correctly, you could not earn higher than an A-. As you might imagine, this was infuriating to some students who really deserved an A. In an evaluation context, sometimes we hear that evaluators believe a new teacher should never get a 4 because they are new to the field. However, it can be extremely frustrating if teachers feel they are not receiving accurate ratings. To check yourself, compare your evidence with the level descriptions in the rubric. Try to keep your personal opinions about the rubric or the evaluation process separate from scoring evaluations. Remember that using the tool with fidelity ultimately benefits teachers. Give honest ratings and feedback. If performance is significantly below expectations, explain why. If the performance is stellar, recognize that performance and explain how performance exceeds expectations. In addition, calibration with colleagues is extremely important. Conducting co-observations or watching a video of practice with a colleague can help you check and see if you tend to stick in the middle when you rate practice. The opposite of central tendency bias is severity or leniency in ratings. This occurs when a rater gives mostly high or low ratings to an educator in a manner inconsistent with the observation data collected. Sometimes we hear evaluators acknowledge that they want to give teachers the benefit of the doubt and maybe rate teachers higher than they should. Remember, the success of evaluation depends on fair, accurate, and meaningful ratings of practice. If you feel like you're being overly lenient or overly harsh, conduct a co-observation with one or more colleagues to check yourself. Another source of bias is called contrast effect. This occurs when an evaluator directly compares the performance of one educator to that of another educator. For example, picture a principal in the back of the room observing a class while also thinking about what he saw in another teacher's classroom just a little while ago. Sometimes it can be hard not to make comparisons, such as, this teacher's classroom management is not as strong as Mrs. A's management. There are two strategies you can use to help minimize the contrast effect. 1. Build in time to rate the teacher directly after the observation. This not only helps ensure that you get information back to the teacher in a timely manner, but also limits potential comparisons. Another strategy is to spread out your observations rather than going directly from one observation to another. For example, you might schedule one observation early in the morning, plan on typing your notes and evidence from the first observation later that morning, and then schedule another observation later in the afternoon after you've done a couple of other things. This way, there is space between your two observations. We have all had experiences where something went terribly wrong during an observation. As challenging as it may be to do so, evaluators must try to not let one event influence the evidence they gathered. For example, once during an ELA lesson, a teacher saw that a student was not following her directions to skip lines during the drafting phase, and then proceeded to yell at the student and rip up the student's work in front of the entire class. As you can imagine, sitting in the back of the room, I was stunned. When I left the classroom, I thought, what a terrible teacher. However, I had to step back and think about what else I had observed during that lesson. Transitions, delivery of content, student-driven discussions of student work, etc. Although this teacher definitely deserved lower ratings in some components based on what I had observed on that one event, there were other aspects of this teacher's practice that were strong. There are a couple of strategies you can use to reduce the likelihood that you let one or two incidents influence your ratings. In the example I shared above, I first had to address the specific event separate from the process. We discussed the incident immediately after the school day, and the teacher apologized to both the student and the student's parents. If something is egregious or exceptional, you should address it then. However, once back in your office, rely on your notes. Take into account the full range of performance. Remember that components are scored separately. Review the level descriptor for each component and focus just on what is included in that component, not anything else that you might have observed. As an evaluator, you might have certain overall impressions of an educator based on what you hear from others or what your first impressions are. If these impressions are allowed to influence your judgment, that might result in a halo error. For example, an evaluator might know that the educator is very proficient in using technology in the classroom, and they allow that to influence their other ratings. Like in the other scenarios described, it's important to focus just on what you see and hear within the individual lesson you are observing. Another source of bias is potential error. This occurs when an evaluator gives higher or lower ratings to an educator because she or he believes the educator has or does not have the potential to be an excellent educator. For example, picture a first-year educator who still has some areas of practice to work on. If you don't want to discourage the teacher, it can be tempting to give her higher ratings than what she deserves because you have the confidence that she will grow over time. Remember, however, that if you do not provide objective evidence and honest feedback, this educator may not know where or how to improve. Focus on the evidence you gathered. In addition, if you find yourself wanting to give higher or lower ratings based on the perceived potential of the educator, remember that there are other places in the evaluation system that assess other dispositions and skills of educators. For example, if your first-year teacher is actively seeking professional growth opportunities, this should be acknowledged in the professional growth domain of professional responsibilities. The next source of error is recency bias. It's natural to remember more at the end of the lesson than the beginning of the lesson. It's how our memories work. However, this can be a potential source of bias. Therefore, do your best to take notes throughout the lesson so that later on you have something to jog your memory. In addition, when writing evidence statements, try to select examples from the beginning, middle, and end of the lesson so that the statements are balanced. The final source of bias we will discuss is similar to me bias. This occurs when an evaluator gives higher ratings to educators who are similar to themselves and lower ratings to educators who are dissimilar. This could be based on teaching experience, content area, race, cultural background, or even teaching style. For example, you might be evaluating a new educator who reminds you of your first experience teaching, or maybe you are evaluating someone who started in the district the same year as you and you feel a bond with that individual. These situations can be challenging. In most cases, you should be able to avoid similar to me bias by leaving your preferences, feelings, or perceptions at the door and focusing on what you see and hear. However, there may be situations where you strongly feel you cannot be objective. For example, maybe an educator is your neighbor, or you are close friends with the teacher. In that case, you might want to assign that person to someone else's caseload, bring in another colleague to co-observe with you, or work with your supervisor to find a different solution. Next, let's talk about triggers. We all have things that get under our skin. Teachers chewing gum, classrooms that are messy. We need to be aware of our triggers so that when we see them, we make sure we do what we can to minimize potential bias and focus just on what we see and hear. A few common triggers are listed here. Review the questions on this slide. Take a minute to think about what some of your triggers might be. What are some of the things that might color the way you view a lesson? We have spoken at length about making sure you capture what you see and hear. During an observation, you will take notes and then we'll turn these into evidence statements, which are examples that support the rating for a component. These evidence statements should be as neutral and illustrative as possible. Many times it is helpful to include numbers. For example, you might note that when a teacher asks for a volunteer, 23 of 24 students raised their hands. During a transition between one activity and the next, you might keep an eye on the clock and estimate how long it took. It is also helpful to include quotes of what students and teachers said. Your notes should not be a running record of everything said, but you might in your evidence statement highlight a key question that the teacher or students asked. It's important to keep evidence statements as objective as possible. As such, evidence statements should not include opinions, judgments, or feedback. Feedback will be recorded elsewhere. Thank you for watching this brief module on bias. Please take a moment to consider the following two questions. What are two possible sources of bias that you will try to avoid? And what are two strategies that you will try to use to make sure your observations are as objective as possible? We hope that this module has helped you understand what bias is, helped you identify some potential triggers, and helped you think about ways you can minimize bias. Next, please complete the assessment on writing objective evidence statements. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us at the email listed below. Thank you so much.